Welcome to this episode of a true crime documentary series exploring cases that challenge our understanding of resilience, determination, and the human capacity to endure. Today, we examine the disappearance of Elizabeth Smart, a case that began on a summer night in Salt Lake City, Utah, and evolved into one of the most closely followed missing person investigations in American history. This is not a story designed to shock or exploit. Instead, it's a careful examination of how a family's unwavering faith intersected with relentless law enforcement work, how a community mobilized with unprecedented unity, and how a young girl survived 9 months of captivity through extraordinary strength and resourcefulness. We approach this narrative with deep respect for Elizabeth, her family, and the countless individuals who refuse to stop searching. Our goal is to illuminate the importance of public awareness in missing person cases, the power of persistence even when hope seems lost, and the remarkable capacity of survivors to reclaim their lives. Our story begins in the pre-dawn hours of June 5, 2002, in the Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah. Federal Heights sits in the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains, an affluent area where homes are nestled against steep terrain, offering sweeping views of the Salt Lake Valley below. The neighborhood is characterized by tree-lined streets, well-maintained properties, and a strong sense of community typical of Salt Lake City's family-oriented culture. It's the kind of place where children play outside freely, where neighbors know each other by name, where safety is assumed rather than questioned. June in Salt Lake City brings warm days and cool nights. The air is dry, scented with sage and pine from the nearby mountains. By early June 2002, school had just let out for summer. For most families in Federal Heights, this meant the beginning of vacation plans, summer camps, and lazy afternoons by backyard pools. Elizabeth Ann Smart was born on November 3, 1987, the second of 6 children in the Smart family. By June 2002, she was 14 years old, finishing her freshman year at Bryant Intermediate School. Those who knew Elizabeth described her as musically gifted, particularly skilled at playing the harp. She was deeply involved in her family's faith, raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and known for her kind demeanor and gentle spirit. She loved horseback riding, performing music, and spending time with her younger siblings. Elizabeth lived with her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, and her 5 siblings in a comfortable 2-story home on Christiana Circle. Ed worked as a real estate broker and mortgage lender. Lois was devoted to raising their children and managing the household. The family was close-knit, their lives structured around faith, education, and community service. They attended church regularly, held family dinners, and maintained the kind of stable, loving home that seemed immune to tragedy. The evening of June 4, 2002 unfolded like countless others in the Smart household. The family had dinner together. Elizabeth practiced her harp. As evening settled into night, the family prepared for bed. Elizabeth shared a bedroom on the 2nd floor with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. The room was painted in soft colors, filled with the belongings of 2 sisters growing up together, stuffed animals, books, family photographs. Ed and Lois checked on their children before retiring to their own bedroom down the hall. The house was secured for the night. Windows were closed or screened against the cool mountain air. Doors were locked. Outside, Federal Heights was quiet. Street lamps cast long shadows across manicured lawns. The occasional car passed, headlights sweeping through the darkness. Nothing suggested that this night would be different from any other. Sometime between Soud and 2:00 a.m. on June 5th, Mary Catherine Smart woke to a presence in the bedroom she shared with Elizabeth. In the darkness, she could make out a figure standing over Elizabeth's bed. The man was speaking to Elizabeth in a low, calm voice. He was telling her to get up, to come with him, to be quiet. Mary Catherine, terrified and confused, lay completely still. She later described feeling paralyzed by fear, unsure if what she was seeing was real or a nightmare. The man was holding something, possibly a knife. Elizabeth, clearly frightened but compliant, rose from her bed. She was wearing red silk pajamas. The man led her toward the bedroom door. Mary Catherine remained frozen in her bed, eyes barely open, watching through the dim light filtering in from the hallway. She heard footsteps moving down the stairs. She heard the faint sound of a door opening and closing. Then, silence. For perhaps 2 hours, Mary Catherine stayed in her bed, wrestling with terror and uncertainty. She was 9 years old, alone in the dark, unsure if the intruder might return. She couldn't process what she had witnessed. Finally, around 4:30 a.m., she crept down the hallway to her parents' bedroom and woke them with words that would shatter their world. "Elizabeth is gone!" Ed and Lois Smart jolted awake. Mary Catherine, trembling and tearful, tried to explain what she had seen. A man had come into their room. He had taken Elizabeth. She was gone. Ed immediately ran to Elizabeth's room, hoping desperately that Mary Catherine had been confused, that it was a nightmare, that Elizabeth would be there asleep in her bed. The bed was empty. He searched the house room by room, calling Elizabeth's name, his voice growing more desperate with each passing second. He checked closets, bathrooms, the basement, every possible place a child might hide or be hiding. Lois joined the search, her mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps Elizabeth had sleepwalked. Perhaps she had gone outside for some reason. Perhaps this was all a terrible misunderstanding. By 4:30 a.m., the reality was undeniable. Elizabeth was not in the house. At 4:01 a.m., Ed Smart called 911. The call was brief and controlled, though the panic beneath his calm voice was unmistakable. He reported that his 14-year-old daughter had been taken from their home by an unknown intruder. The dispatcher immediately escalated the call to priority status. Salt Lake City police officers arrived at the Christiana Circle home within minutes. The initial responding officers secured the house and began a room-by-room search to confirm Elizabeth was not hiding or injured somewhere inside. They interviewed Ed, Lois, and Mary Catherine separately to establish what had happened. Mary Catherine's account, though delivered through tears and fragmented by trauma, was consistent. A man had entered their room, woken Elizabeth, and taken her away. She described him as wearing light-colored clothing, possibly tan or beige. She thought he might have been wearing a cap or hat. His voice had been soft, almost gentle, but commanding. He had told Elizabeth to come with him and not to make noise. The detail that would haunt investigators immediately was the manner of entry. Officers found a kitchen window cut open, the screen removed carefully and placed aside. The window led to a small laundry room area that connected to the rest of the house. The cut was clean, deliberate, suggesting premeditation and familiarity with breaking and entering techniques. As dawn broke over Salt Lake City on June 5, 2002, the full machinery of law enforcement began to mobilize. The Salt Lake City Police Department established command at the Smart residence. Detectives from the department's Crimes Against Children unit took over the investigation. By 7:30 a.m., the FBI had been contacted. Given the potential for kidnapping across state lines, federal involvement was both appropriate. An Amber Alert, a system still relatively new in 2002, was issued for Elizabeth Smart. Her description went out across Utah and into neighboring states. 14-year-old white female, approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall, slender build, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing red silk pajamas. The alert included a recent school photograph showing Elizabeth's warm smile and gentle eyes. Word spread through Federal Heights and across Salt Lake City with stunning speed. By mid-morning, neighbors began gathering outside the Smart home, offering support, asking what they could do to help. The story hit local television and radio stations. By afternoon, it had gone national. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Salt Lake City, with its strong cultural emphasis on family and community service, mobilized like few cities had before. Within 24 hours of Elizabeth's disappearance, thousands of volunteers had registered to help search. The LDS Church, a powerful organizational force in Utah, activated its network of meeting houses and members. Search coordinators established a command center at a local elementary school. Law enforcement organized the volunteer efforts into grid searches. Teams of volunteers, many wearing matching T-shirts printed overnight with Elizabeth's photo, fanned out across the foothills above Federal Heights. They searched canyons, creek beds, abandoned buildings, and remote trails. The terrain was challenging, steep and rocky, with dense vegetation in places, but the searchers persisted from sunrise to sunset. Detectives, meanwhile, worked methodically through the evidence and witness statements. They interviewed every neighbor within a quarter-mile radius. They reviewed security camera footage from nearby businesses and residences, though in 2002, such systems were far less common than today. They compiled lists of registered sex offenders in the area and began the time-consuming process of locating and interviewing each one. The cut window presented both a lead and a puzzle. The precision of the cut suggested someone with experience, possibly someone who had committed similar crimes. Forensic teams dusted for fingerprints and collected trace evidence from the window frame and surrounding area. Initial results were inconclusive. No clear prints were recovered. Mary Catherine was interviewed again, this time by specially trained child forensic interviewers. They worked gently, understanding that she was both a traumatized child and the only witness to the crime. She repeated her account, adding small details as her memory allowed. The man had been tall. He had spoken about taking Elizabeth for ransom. She thought his clothing looked old or worn. One detail she mentioned almost in passing would later prove critical. She thought the man's voice had sounded familiar, like someone she might have heard before, but she couldn't place it. Ed and Lois Smart made the decision early to speak publicly. On June 6th, less than 48 hours after Elizabeth vanished, they appeared at a press conference alongside Salt Lake City Police Chief Rick Dinsey. The room was packed with reporters from local and national outlets. Cameras from every major network were present. Ed Smart, his voice steady but his eyes red from sleeplessness and tears, spoke directly to whoever had taken his daughter. "Please let her come home. She is loved. She is missed. We will do whatever it takes to bring her back safely." Lois, standing beside him, added her own plea. "Elizabeth is our daughter, our sister, our friend. If you know anything, please come forward." The press conference had its intended effect. Elizabeth's face appeared on newscasts across the country. Her story led the evening news. Major newspapers ran front-page coverage. The case became a focal point of national attention in a way that few missing child cases had before. As June progressed, the investigation expanded in multiple directions. Detectives explored every possibility. Was this a stranger abduction? A family acquaintance? Could there be a connection to Ed Smart's real estate business or financial dealings? Investigators conducted extensive background checks on the entire Smart family, a standard but painful process that left the family feeling scrutinized even as they grieved. Hundreds of tips poured into the dedicated hotline established for the case. Psychics called with visions. Well-meaning citizens reported sightings of girls who resembled Elizabeth in other states. Conspiracy theories began to circulate online and in tabloid coverage. Each tip, no matter how improbable, was logged and investigated. The Smart family, meanwhile, lived in a state of suspended animation. Ed continued to work with investigators daily. Lois focused on holding the family together, maintaining routines for the younger children even as their world had been shattered. The 5 Smart siblings, ranging from young children to teenagers, struggled to process the absence of their sister and a constant presence of police, media, and strangers in their home. The family's faith became both a source of strength and public fascination. They spoke often about prayer, about trusting in God's plan, about believing Elizabeth would come home. Some found their faith inspiring. Others questioned whether their religious convictions might be blinding them to darker possibilities. By the end of June, the massive ground searches began to scale back. After 3 weeks of intensive effort, volunteers had covered hundreds of square miles. They had searched every canyon, every remote structure, every conceivable hiding place within reasonable distance of Salt Lake City. No trace of Elizabeth had been found. No physical evidence had surfaced beyond the cut window screen. Investigators shifted their focus to behavioral analysis and victimology. FBI profilers studied the crime scene, the method of entry, and the apparent lack of violence. The fact that the intruder had taken Elizabeth alive, had spoken calmly to her, and had left Mary Catherine unharmed suggested a specific intent. This was not a crime of opportunity or rage. It appeared planned, controlled, targeted. One theory that gained traction involved the possibility of someone who had been inside the Smart home before, someone familiar with the layout. Detectives compiled lists of workers, service providers, and casual acquaintances who might have had access. They interviewed dozens of people, looking for anyone who might fit Mary Catherine's vague description or who had behaved suspiciously. In late June, attention briefly focused on Richard Ricci, a handyman who had worked at the Smart home earlier in 2002. Ricci had a criminal history including burglary and had been employed by Ed Smart for several weeks doing repairs. Detectives learned that Ricci had been seen driving a white Jeep Cherokee that had been found abandoned with items inside belonging to the Smart family. Items Ed had allowed Ricci to take as partial payment. Ricci was questioned extensively. He denied any involvement in Elizabeth's disappearance. He had an alibi for the night in question, confirmed by his wife and others, but his criminal background and connection to the family made him a person of interest. He was arrested on an unrelated parole violation and remained in custody while investigators continued to probe his possible involvement. Throughout July and August, the case remained in the national spotlight, but leads grew thinner. The initial surge of volunteer energy had given way to a more sustainable but smaller core group of dedicated supporters. The Ed and Lois Smart established a website and continued to do media appearances, keeping Elizabeth's face visible. Then, in late August 2002, Richard Ritchie died of a brain hemorrhage while in custody. His death was investigated and ruled natural, but it left a void in the investigation. Many investigators had believed Ritchie was involved. His death meant certain questions would never be answered. The Smart family publicly stated they did not believe Ritchie was responsible. They continued to maintain that whoever took Elizabeth would be found, that she was still alive, and that hope was not lost. As summer faded into fall, the case began to shift in tone. The initial frenzy had passed, the daily volunteer searches had ended. What remained was the quiet, grinding work of detectives following diminishing leads and a family living with an absence that refused to heal. October came and went, marking 4 months since Elizabeth's disappearance. November brought Elizabeth's 15th birthday, a day the Smart family marked with a vigil attended by hundreds. December arrived with cold weather and the approach of Christmas. The family left Elizabeth's stocking hanging with the others, a symbol of hope that felt increasingly fragile. Then, in early October, something shifted. Mary Catherine Smart, now 10 years old, came to her parents with information that would change everything. She had been thinking about the intruder's voice, the familiarity she had mentioned months earlier. After months of the memory working at the edges of her consciousness, she finally placed it. She believed the man who took Elizabeth might have been someone called Emmanuel, a man who had done work at their house once, several months before the abduction. She remembered him because he had been unusual, soft-spoken but intense, and he had talked about religion and being a prophet. Ed and Lois immediately contacted investigators. The name Emmanuel meant nothing initially, but with Mary Catherine's description, detectives began searching through records of workers and day laborers who had been at the Smart residence. They found him. Emmanuel was an alias. His real name was Brian David Mitchell. Mitchell was a 49-year-old transient with a history of mental illness and religious delusion. In November 2001, Lois Smart had hired him for a single day to help repair a roof. He had called himself Emmanuel and had spoken extensively about receiving revelations from God. He had worked for 5 hours, been paid, and left. The family had barely thought of him since. Investigators scrambled to locate Mitchell. They discovered he had a wife, Wanda Barzee, and that the couple lived a nomadic existence, sometimes homeless, sometimes staying in camps in the foothills above Salt Lake City. Both had histories of mental health issues. Mitchell claimed to be a prophet and had written religious manifestos describing his divine mission. Police distributed flyers with Mitchell and Barzee's photographs, asking the public for sightings. The couple was known to frequent downtown Salt Lake City, often panhandling near Temple Square. But in the months following the renewed focus on them, detectives learned more about his background. He had been married multiple times, had children from previous relationships who described him as increasingly unstable over the years. His writings revealed disturbing beliefs about polygamy and being commanded by God to take additional wives. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but Mitchell himself remained elusive. Sightings were reported from California to Arizona, but none were confirmed. As winter turned to spring 2003, Elizabeth had been missing for 9 months. Then, on March 12, 2003, everything converged. Several people called police reporting sightings of 2 women in veils and a man matching Mitchell's description walking through the streets of Sandy, Utah, a suburb south of Salt Lake City. The reports were specific enough that officers were dispatched to investigate. At approximately 1:30 p.m., Salt Lake City Police and Sandy Police located the trio walking along State Street. The man matched Brian Mitchell's description. He was accompanied by 2 women wearing veils that covered their faces and bodies. When approached by officers, Mitchell initially claimed the women were his wives and that they were traveling ministers. Officers, suspicious and aware of the Smart case, asked the veiled women to identify themselves. One gave a name that didn't match any records. Officers persisted, asking her to remove her veil. She initially refused, then slowly complied. Beneath the gray veil was Elizabeth Smart. She was 15 years old now, nearly 9 months older than the girl who had disappeared from her bedroom. She was dressed in unconventional clothing, layers of robes and fabrics. Her appearance was altered, her demeanor subdued, but officers recognized her immediately from the photographs they had studied for months. The moment of recognition was electric. Officers immediately separated Elizabeth from Mitchell and Barzee. Both Mitchell and Barzee were taken into custody without resistance. Elizabeth was transported to a secure location where victim advocates and medical personnel were waiting. The news broke within the hour. Elizabeth Smart had been found alive. The case that had captivated the nation, that had seemed to slip into the cold case files, had ended in the outcome everyone had hoped for, but few had dared to believe would happen. Ed and Lois Smart were notified immediately. They rushed to be reunited with their daughter. The moment was private, sacred to the family, but those who witnessed it described an overwhelming cascade of relief, joy, and tears. Elizabeth was taken to a hospital for evaluation. Physically, she was unharmed in the sense of visible injuries. The psychological impact, however, would take years to fully understand and address. Within hours, the full story began to emerge, though many details would remain private out of respect for Elizabeth. Mitchell had indeed been the intruder who entered the Smart home on June 5, 2002. He had taken Elizabeth at knife point, leading her on foot into the foothills behind Federal Heights, where he and Barzee maintained a primitive camp. There, in a makeshift tent hidden among the trees, Elizabeth had been held captive. Mitchell, operating under profound delusions, believed he was a prophet commanded by God to take Elizabeth as his wife. He performed a mock marriage ceremony shortly after the abduction. He controlled Elizabeth through a combination of threats, religious manipulation, and constant supervision. Barzee actively participated in the captivity, serving as a guard and enforcer. Elizabeth had been moved multiple times. The trio had traveled to California for several weeks in the fall of 2002, living on beaches and in camps. They had returned to Utah by early 2003. Throughout, Elizabeth had been seen in public numerous times, dressed in veils and robes that concealed her identity. She had been walked through downtown Salt Lake City, past her own missing posters, but the disguise and Mitchell's control had prevented her from escaping or being recognized. The question that haunted many was why Elizabeth hadn't tried to escape during those public moments. Experts in trauma and coercive control explained the complex psychological mechanisms at play. Mitchell had used religious rhetoric to convince Elizabeth that her family would be harmed if she resisted. He had dehumanized her, stripped her identity, and created an environment where compliance seemed like the only option for survival. At 15, isolated and terrorized, Elizabeth had done what she needed to do to stay alive. Brian Mitchell was charged with aggravated kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and aggravated burglary. Wanda Barzee faced similar charges for her role in the abduction and captivity. The legal process would be lengthy and complex. Mitchell was evaluated by multiple mental health experts. He claimed incompetence to stand trial, citing his religious beliefs and delusions. For years, the case languished in court as judges wrestled with questions of mental illness versus criminal responsibility. Mitchell's behavior in court was often bizarre, singing hymns, refusing to acknowledge the proceedings, insisting he was a prophet. Finally, in 2010, 8 years after the crime, Brian Mitchell was tried in federal court. Elizabeth Smart, now 23 years old, testified. Her testimony was composed, clear, and devastating. She described the abduction, the months of captivity, the psychological manipulation, and the terror she had endured. The jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts, Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee was sentenced separately to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty. She was released in 2018 after serving her sentence. For Elizabeth Smart and her family, the end of the legal proceedings marked not closure, but the beginning of a new chapter. Elizabeth had already begun the work of recovery and rebuilding her life even before the trial concluded. In the years following her rescue, Elizabeth pursued education, graduating from high school, then attending Brigham Young University where she studied music. She married in 2012 and has since built a family of her own. She has 3 children and lives a life defined not by what happened to her, but by the purpose she has chosen to pursue. Elizabeth made the remarkable decision to become a public advocate. She has spoken openly about her experience, not to sensationalize it, but to educate. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, which focuses on preventing crimes against children, supporting survivors, and promoting legislative changes to protect the vulnerable. She has testified before Congress on issues related to child safety and exploitation. She has written books, including her memoir, My Story, which details her abduction and recovery with honesty and grace. She has become a sought-after speaker, traveling the country to talk about resilience, healing, and the importance of supporting survivors without judgment. Her advocacy work has helped shift public understanding of how victims of abduction and assault respond to trauma. She has challenged victim-blaming narratives and emphasized the complex psychological realities that survivors navigate. Her voice has become one of the most powerful in the movement to protect children and support those who have endured unimaginable experiences. The Smart family has also used their experience to help others. They remained active in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and have supported numerous families facing similar crises. They speak often about the role of faith, community, and persistence in their journey. The case itself left lasting impacts on law enforcement and public awareness. The massive volunteer effort in Salt Lake City became a model for community mobilization in missing person cases. The role of media coverage in keeping Elizabeth's face visible was studied and incorporated into best practices for missing child investigations. The importance of listening to child witnesses, even when their memories are fragmented or delayed, was reinforced. Mary Catherine's eventual recollection of the intruder's voice proved to be the breakthrough that identified Mitchell. Her courage in coming forward, even months later, changed the course of the investigation. The case also highlighted the challenges of identifying and managing individuals with severe mental illness who pose risks to public safety. Mitchell's history of delusion and instability had been known to some, but systems failed to intervene effectively. For many families still searching for missing loved ones, Elizabeth Smart's story remains a beacon. It demonstrates that even after months of silence, even when hope seems irrational, recovery is possible. It reminds us that persistence in searching, in keeping cases active, in refusing to give up matters profoundly. Today, Elizabeth Smart is a wife, mother, advocate, and survivor who has chosen to live fully and purposefully. She has transformed trauma into a platform for change. She embodies the resilience that her family always believed she possessed. The story of Elizabeth Smart's disappearance and recovery is ultimately not about the 9 months of captivity. It's about the strength of a young girl who survived, the love of a family that never stopped believing, the determination of a community that refused to forget, and the power of one person to reclaim their life and use it to protect others. Thank you for listening to this account. If you or someone you know needs support related to child abduction, sexual assault, or trauma recovery, resources are available through the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. Hope endures, and the work to protect and heal continues.